What's your way of thinking about the continuing decline? The fact that even now we've become used to hearing each year that the number of people in the labor movement has shrunk from the year before. What?
One of the things I think that has happened is that the political leadership of this country has turned away from unions. We're not popular with them anymore, all right? And how does that manifest itself? And I challenge you. Who was the last president you would say in this country was pro-union?
That's hard.
It's hard, isn't it?
It's very hard.
I'll give you the answer that I have, and you're not going to like the answer. Lyndon Johnson.
Yes. I thought maybe the peanut farmer, but he wasn't much.
He wasn't much. So we have to go back to Lyndon Johnson.
Right. So we're talking half a century.
We're talking about, 1968.
Right.
He's out of office. So that's the stuff that's going on. First of all, we have not had the political leadership saying what FDR said, I want you to join a union. And why not? Why can't they say that? Because it's not popular anymore to talk that way. The second thing is I think we in the labor movement are responsible for that. When I first started working with the teachers union, it was well known within the union movement that private sector unions were funding the efforts of public sector unions. So the steel workers, the auto workers dumped millions of dollars so there could be an AFT, so there could be an AFSCME. We're not doing that anymore. Now I think it's time for the public sector unions to say, okay, here we are, and then we're going to bring you back to life at this point.
The private sector unions.
Yes. And then, it's the law. We have a labor board. Obama made it slightly better, but still a labor board that more often than not rules that employers can campaign against unions. And the final thing I would say is us. We're not as imaginative, we're not as bold, we're not as willing to take risks as we used to be.
What do you see is happening that might revive something like the labor movement, the left movement that was in existence and effective in the 1930s? What are the chances and how could it emerge again?
Well, I think the Occupy movement was exciting for that reason. People criticized it because they said, well, there's no Act Two. And yeah, that's true. Right. But nonetheless, millions of people were affected by that. Right. I mean, millions.
It's hard to imagine the Bernie campaign without the Occupy.
And it's hard to imagine a university campus where there wasn't a door with 1% on it,
yes,
right? It was worldwide, is what I'm saying.
Yes.
I think that those people who did that must continue doing things like that. Guys my age, all we can do is support them. Will they do things that you and I would want them to do? Probably not. But they're going to bring imagination back into things and joy back into things, and that's what we need.
Yeah, I have the same feeling, Frank. I've told this story. If the people who organized the sit-in at Zuccotti Park here in New York City, where Occupy had its base, if they had come to me in the summer before and said, we're planning to set up some tents in that park, what do you think? I would have told them, you're crazy, no one will care, you'll get a story in the back page of the newspaper, and it'll be forgotten. I'm so glad they never came, so they didn't get this bad advice from me, because that imagination was the right thing at the right time. Who could have imagined that within a matter of weeks, 350 cities across America would have encampments on their downtown parks? It was a stunning.
And around the world.
Paris, Berlin, everywhere.
London,
Okay, so let me get back to something that you and I have in common. I'm a professor. You have been a professor. We are people who are making an interview on the radio and TV now. What's our role? What can we say, though, about what's going on that might help to the rebuilding of a labor movement?
I read every day the New York Times, and most of the times I want to rip it up and throw it away, right? Because it has this unbelievable bias about things. So you providing these kinds of services to people, this kind of analysis for people. But at the same time, I think we have to keep a distance so that the younger generation could really lead this fight, which they have to.
I know at some points you taught me things about labor movements in other parts of the world. Yeah. Are there things going on that you're aware of elsewhere that Americans need to think about, to know about?
Well, both of our favorite countries is France.
Right.
I think people ought to look at France in terms of what they mean by a labor movement. They don't mean what we mean, millions of people are members or paying dues or anything like that. They mean what people will go on strike, what people will actually risk something. That's the labor movement. that is made even conservative politicians like, if everybody remembers Sarkozy, the former president, right? He actually made a deal with the unions. He said to the unions, okay, I'm willing to throw more money into the unions, but let's have the workers choose which unions they want to represent them, and 5 of you will be chosen, all right? What does that mean? One of the things that Stanley Aronowitz talks about, Tom Cahogan talks about in their books, is getting rid of this notion of exclusive representation. To have minority unions, to have people go out there and say, we want to be recognized and we don't care if anybody else dislikes us. See what happens.
I love this, because see what happens is your way of saying something that strikes me as so important. We can't stay with the model we have because it has failed us. And there are a lot of reasons for it. I don't mean only to blame the union leadership or anything like that. But if you're following a certain kind of organizational model for 50 years and you're on a 50-year decline, you've got to be self-critical, because how you organize is one of the few things you have some control over, and clearly it's not working. So that these ideas, such as allowing multiple unions at a workplace, these are the kinds of changes and questionings of a model that anything like a healthy union movement would have to encourage, it seems to me.
Yeah, especially now where I think we have a very weak federal government at this point. We also ought to encourage people to say really, really radical kinds of things. Like, for example, over and over again, we want socialized medicine, and we're not afraid to use that term. We want what England has. We want what Italy has. We want even what France has. It's better than what we got. People need to say that. Oh, they'll be called all kinds of names, but so what? Some people will listen. I go back to when my mother, in 1933, many of the shirt shops and the blouse factories left New York because the unions had become so strong. The National Industrial Act was passed by Roosevelt, all right? The New York unions, the ILGW, the Amalgamated, sent organizers, Yiddish organizers, Italian organizers, black organizers. And in 1 year, they organized everything in the city of New Haven. Why? Because they said to people, your lives could be better. The NIRA says you ought to be working, and it did in those days, you ought to be working 35 hours a week, not 60. They got the union in, and that changed literally overnight. So, we can't be afraid of articulating what a good life could be.
Absolutely. It's the greatest criticism of America. With all it's achieved, the gap between what could be in this country and what is, that's the issue to attack, because there's no justification for giving all this wealth to a tiny 1% while everybody else...
And it gets bigger and bigger. The gap gets bigger and bigger.
Even after the crash of 2008, it doesn't stop.
It doesn't stop. That's right. So I think people cannot be ashamed to say things like this. People my age, what do we have to lose anymore? That's the way I feel about it.
Okay.